Thanks again, Alex, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to today's webcast, and thank you for joining. My name is Dylan Mulvihill, and I'm an associate at Celigence, and today we'll be going over clinical evaluations for unique product types under the EU MDR. And joining me for today's featured presentations will be Dr. Matthias Fink, who is the manager of the clinical focus team of North America for Psur, as well as Dr. Pratibha Mishra, a medical device and regulatory subject matter expert here at Celigence. And if you have any questions about Celigence's capabilities or experiences, feel free to contact me at the email address at the bottom of the screen. So today's agenda will include an introduction about Celigence from myself, and immediately following that will be our first presentation from Dr. Pratibha Mishra, who will take us through the most salient points of clinical evaluations with regards to unique product types and software as a medical device products. And directly after that, Dr. Matthias Fink will be taking us through his presentation, providing insights from his perspective from a notified body. And following that, I will walk us through a few case studies based on previous and ongoing MDR clinical evaluation projects that our team has worked on. And finally, after that, we will have time to field questions from the audience and open the webcast up for a discussion panel and Q&A led by our two presenters, as well as John Bradsher, a medical device regulatory expert here at Celigence, and Sharma Pokuluri, also a medical device regulatory expert and consultant here at Celigence. Altogether, these four have well over 50 years of combined medical device regulatory experience. So to provide you with a background on Celigence, we were formed in 2017 with the intent of improving quality and compliance while reducing the costs for the life sciences industry. We serve some of the top global companies in both the device and the pharmaceutical sectors. Celigence also provides niche regulatory affairs services such as MDR gap analysis, CER writing, device registrations, and other operational and strategic activities required for global device compliance. Our offices are located in Chicago in the US, where our headquarters is, and London in the UK, as well as Bangalore, India. Celigence's delivery center in India, combined with our large network of device experts, allows us to provide an onshore-offshore model to our clients, which ensures both high quality and cost efficiency. You can email me with any further questions at the address again towards the bottom of this slide. And now I would like to pass things off to Dr. Pratibha Mishra for our first featured presentation. Thank you.
Good evening. I am glad to be here to be talking about clinical evaluation of medical devices and the output of the process, the clinical evaluation report, or the CER, and important points to consider when performing clinical evaluation of unique product types like drug device combination products and medical device software. Dylan, next slide, please.
You should have control over it now.
No, I'm sorry, I can't seem to move the slides forward. Can you do that for me?
Yes.
Thank you. So before we move on, just a little bit about myself. I am an associate manager for the medical device services team here at Celigence. I have a master's degree in oral medicine and maxillofacial radiology and have a background of working in hospitals as well as an academician. I've written and reviewed several regulatory documentation for medical devices of all classes in a wide range of therapy areas. Here at Celigence, I lead a team of highly qualified medical writers, and we have expertise in clinical evaluation of complex devices, including medical device software and drug device combination products. So, clinical evaluation is addressed by Article 61, Part A of the MDR, and it has several mentions throughout the regulation. It's well understood to be an important process in the device life cycle. It's very closely related to other pre and post-market activities that take place during the life cycle of a medical device. Findings from a CR, for example, will feed into the ISO 14971 risk management process. Clinical evaluation will also inform the decision of whether post-market clinical follow-up activities are required for a device, what type of activities can be planned, or if one is planned already, it will serve as an input for the CER. The MTCG 2027 and 8 guidances, which provide templates for PMCF's plan and report, state quite clearly actually that the impact of PMCF on the CER needs to be considered. The post-market surveillance plan also will have to consider the findings of the CER, and the CER will in turn evaluate the findings from the PMS report in terms of device safety. Furthermore, MDR also requires creation and maintenance of additional documentation like the summary of safety and clinical performance and the periodic safety and update report, which along with the vigilance reports have to be uploaded to the UDAMID database. The SSCP and PSUR, these new documents, are also interlinked with the CR in terms of information that is captured in these documents. Next slide, please. Clinical evaluation requires inputs from several cross-functional experts. The marketing team, for example, will provide information on similar devices. The clinical research team for planned or ongoing or completed clinical investigations. Regulatory experts for the guidelines and standards that are applicable for the device under evaluation. The risk team for potential risks and residual risks associated with the device. All these stakeholders need to be involved in the planning, creation, and maintenance of a CER. Next slide. Before clinical evaluation is undertaken, a plan is created, which is stage 0 of the process. The plan is intended to outline the scope and the pathway of clinical evaluation to be followed, and it serves as a basis for further steps. The MedDev Revision 4 guideline provides a checklist with considerations for a CEP that's a very useful document to refer to in the planning stage. The next three stages, stage 1 to 3, involve identifying the relevant sources of data, appraising the quality and suitability of data with respect to safety and performance of the device under evaluation, and analysis of evidence gathered from these data sources. Stage 4, which will involve the creation of the final report by deriving conclusions from the data that has been analyzed so far and demonstrating compliance to the general safety and performance requirements from Annex 1 of the MDR related to device safety, performance, and the benefit risk profile when used as intended. This is not the end of the process, though. After submission of the CR to the notified body, there may be observations from the reviewers which need to be addressed. The CR also is a live document that needs periodic updates. The frequency of these updates will be dictated by the risk category of the device and the post-market experience. For example, identification of a new risk may, from the PMS data, may instigate an update of a CR. Next slide. The content that goes into a CR is heterogeneous. The sources of input data may be internal, that is data that the manufacturer generates during the life cycle of the product, or data from external sources. Internal data may include verification and validation testing, other performance or safety related preclinical studies that have been conducted, biocompatibility evaluation, etc. And external sources of data can be clinical trial registries, published literature that can be found from literature databases, or adverse event databases that are maintained by regulatory authorities of different countries. Some examples are here on the slide. depending upon the region where the device is marketed, these databases can serve as a source of information on safety alerts or recalls or other information that is reported for the device or similar devices. Next slide. At this point, I would like to touch upon some essential aspects to be included in every CR for compliance with MDR requirements. State of the art. So the CR is required to include a review of current technical capabilities or accepted clinical practice with respect to the device or the procedure or patient management, the placement of the medical device vis-a-vis other diagnostic or therapeutic options that needs to be presented. In our experience here at Celogens, we have found that quantitative or at least a comprehensive qualitative assessment of benefits and risks of the device in comparison to other alternatives is in focus during notified body reviews of a CR. Talking about clinical data, the extent of clinical data that needs to be presented depends on the novelty and the complexity of a device. Once again, MedDev Revision 4 is a helpful guide to what kind of data can serve as evidence and how to appraise this data. The approach that we follow is generally to critically analyze the evidence in terms of how it links to the state of the art and meets specific predetermined safety and performance objectives. We've seen that clinical evidence that the notified body expects in a CER is expected to support each indication of a device or each indication of all the devices if there's more than one device under evaluation. Non-clinical or preclinical data like the usability and human factor evaluation studies are also important sources of information to substantiate performance where they can be leveraged. Once again, validation to standards or other performance testing, bench testing that needs to be linked to the actual clinical performance or the state-of-the-art requirements from the particular device or device family when the data is being analyzed. This is something that notified body observations tend to highlight, the gap between information presented and its meaning in terms of demonstrating safety and performance. Post-market surveillance, well, all of us know that the reliance on reactive post-market data is no longer sufficient. Post-market data needs to be proactively collected, and that's very important under MDR. PMCF activities are indicated when clinical evidence, when more clinical evidence is required. And as I mentioned before, data collected from PMCF will feed into the CR and the conformity assessment that is done as part of CR. Equivalence. This is a very important topic. The MDCG 2025 guidance should serve as the basis for clinical evaluation if equivalence pathway is to be followed. Dr. Fink will talk about equivalence under MDR in his presentation. I would just like to say that based on our experience with notified body observations, it is very important to select the right device as the equivalent device if this pathway is chosen. All of this data ultimately is required for analysis and substantiation of the benefit-risk ratio in the favor of the device. All the data that we have so far collated needs to be analyzed to highlight the type, magnitude, and duration of benefits that are offered to the patient or the user, what is the medical necessity that the device serves, and whether the benefit-risk ratio is substantiated by evidence that is precise and falsifiable. Next slide. Moving to medical device software, specifically their clinical evaluation. With MDR, it is now critical to evaluate the benefit-risk profile of a software in its own right, The classification of the software as a device or accessory is independent of its location or how it's interconnected with the hardware. It depends, in fact, on the risk associated with its involvement in the medical decision making. As you can see on the graph on the right side of the slide, it is a factor of the significance of information that is provided by the software and its role in the diagnosis or therapy, and the seriousness of or the criticality of the medical condition. When conducting clinical evaluation for medical device software, in addition to traditional evidence that is gathered from literature, it's also a useful approach to include survey-based studies for substantiating performance. Also, demonstration of equivalence where possible, as per MedDev Revision 4 and MDCG 2025 guidance, can be considered with similar products in the market. Next slide, please. The table that you see here, this is adapted from MDCG 2021, Rule 11, and it corresponds to Rule 11 of the MDR. The clinical evidence to be presented in the CR, it will depend on the intended use of the software. The software could have an independent intended use and clinical benefits, or it could have an intended use and clinical benefits that drives or influences another medical device that serves a medical purpose. Or the software may have no intended purpose of its own. It may just be an accessory or a component of another medical device. So, for example, when establishing state-of-the-art in the CR for such for a software, can be based on the review of literature for establishing clinical validation, a comparative assessment with other devices with the same intended use or other software that works on the same base algorithm can be and one of the approaches. For technical validation, that can be demonstrated by validation studies that are conducted for software architecture design per IEC 62304 and the main operating function per IEC 62366. Now, this is data that the manufacturer will already have from the pre-market activities that were performed for the particular software. This can be leveraged into the clinical evaluation for these kind of devices. Risk evaluation, among other things, should include review of cybersecurity vulnerability databases of different agencies, such as the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, or ENISA. There are several databases similar to ENISA that can be a good source of information for risks related to cybersecurity, and assessment of the benefits offered by a device by the software, irrespective of its categorization, versus the risks that are involved based on its involvement in the medical decision making is what needs to be highlighted in a clinical evaluation report. Next slide, please. Moving on to the drug device combination products. A combination product will consist of a pharmaceutical product and a medical device. Just to describe it in brief, these products may be integral or non-integral, among other types. MDR has introduced new requirements for notified body involvement in the regulatory approval process for integral medical devices under Article 117. The market authorization dossier for such products, which is submitted to the competent authorities, is now expected to include an assessment of the conformity to GSPRs for the device component of such products. A clinical evaluation report can be a document that demonstrates conformity to GSPRs to fulfill the requirement that Article 117 has raised for such products. The demonstration of clinical evidence for these products has become much more significant under MDR than previous directives. The CR is, it should be noted, it's a separate process. It cannot replace the investigational studies that are conducted for the drug entity. Often these investigations, however, do not consider evaluation of the safety or performance of the medical device component as its key endpoints. So for a new device under development, this is an important consideration to be made now under the new regulations. In the clinical development plan stage, one can include such studies or include key device measures to focus on the device component when a clinical investigation is being planned. For cases where the device is already in the market, PMCF studies can be useful. PMCF focused on the safety and performance aspect of the device component. That can help gather clinical evidence for a DDC product. Next slide, please. For when talking about clinical evaluations for such products, the state of the art in the CER can be based on a description of the technical platform or device families that these devices work on, and provide, once again, a comparative assessment from literature on with other alternative delivery systems and their benefit and risk to the patient or users. In addition, it has to be highlighted in the CER what the direct benefits are from such devices from its intended use, as well as indirect benefits such as the ease of use or quality of life that is offered by using such products as compared to alternatives. And these benefits need to be weighed against risks, such as those arising from, among other things, interaction of the drug and device components. It must be kept in mind, though, that the final decision of the safety and performance of these kind of devices still rests with the competent authorities. If there are concerns for safety, for example, the stability of the drug component or the integration of the two components, if that's under question, then the notified body opinion reports that have been provided under Article 117, they may be overruled by the competent authority's decision. In conclusion, a well-planned regulatory strategy needs to be in place for medical device software and drug device combination products, just like any other medical device. It should be in place as early as possible in the life cycle. A clinical evaluation plan much early in the life cycle will help to ascertain what is the amount of clinical evidence that's available, if there is need for a PMCF activity. And the CER that will follow this plan will serve as an important document to demonstrate the safety and performance and the favorable benefit risk ratio of the device when used in the field, which is critical and which is what the notified bodies are looking for in their review. This concludes my presentation. I would now like to invite Dr. Matthias Fink to continue with the presentation. Dr. Matthias, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dylan. Let's see if the
Should have control now.
It looks like, yes. Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Quick introduce myself. My name is Matthias Fink. Background is I'm a board-certified orthopedic surgeon, 17 years experience, mostly in Germany. And since 4.5 years now, I'm working for TÜV Süd as a clinical reviewer. And now, beside just being clinical reviewer, I'm also responsible for our internal team of orthopedic surgeons reviewing all the orthopedic devices. And also now, since this year, I'm responsible here for our clinical team here in the US. And my presentation will be a little bit broader since there's no real defined clinical requirements from the clinical perspective, from the clinical evaluation for those what you call unique devices like drug device combinations or medical software, the requirements when it comes to clinical evaluation and the requirements what type of clinical data can be used does not really change. So I will step back a little bit, have a little bit of a more of a high level overview. I have some slides on drug device combination and software myself, but as I said, I'm focusing more on the requirements of the clinical data itself. Yeah, a lot of things are clear now. We already got a lot of MDCG documents published. There will be more guidance documents coming. There's still discussion of the interpretation of certain paragraphs and articles of the MDR. So what I'm going to talk about today is our current interpretation, but there might be some changes along the way, again, depending on what's coming up again. Sorry about that. I just mentioned the MDCG guidance documents, a lot of them already published. A couple of more are to come. We're still waiting for some, let's say PSUR, periodic safety update report for the post-market setting. It's not the topic here, but this is some guidance document. Everyone is very anxiously waiting for that. We got a couple of guidance documents already published, which are related to clinical evaluation and especially to those unique clinical devices. One is the NSUG 2019-11 on the classification of software as a medical device, and also the 2020-1 on clinical evaluation of medical device software. So for all of you who are out there who are having a software, that probably I know that for software it's a big change because it wasn't really considered under the previous directives. So there's a big step forward to a lot of those software manufacturers or manufacturers who have the software as an integral part of the medical device. So as I said, we cannot consult as a notified body, but of course I always recommend to read those guidance documents. They are not legally binding. They are guidance documents. They are not a regulation. They are not the law. But the way it is in Europe, in the competent authorities of the different member states, they require notified bodies to follow those guidance documents. So the notified bodies are going to challenge you on the requirements as set out in those guidance documents. So really encourage everyone, please be familiar with those guidance documents because you might get some challenge on that from your notified body. Two guidance documents everyone really was waiting for is the 2020-5 and -6 on equivalence approach and on sufficient clinical data for legacy devices. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later on. And there's also, I think July or so, we got the MDCG guidance on transitional provisions for consultations. Quickly, as I said, I'm going to talk about consultations for drug device combinations and what is required from a clinical perspective for those drug device combinations. And the last one in this list is the NDCG 2020-13, a clinical relation assessment report template, which basically is the unique and template that every notified body is expected to follow, that the notified body has to have to use for our assessment of the clinical evaluation report we are going to get from the manufacturers. For certain devices, I'm only mentioning consultation according to Article 54, mandatory clinical consultations with the expert panel. Some of those CEAR reports will be publicly available, at least for the expert panels, not for the public, but for the expert panels and for the competent authorities. So this is why now we have this aligned template that every notified body is expected to use. And this template, of course, is publicly available. So the notified bodies will probably implement it into their own documents. But whenever I encourage everyone, please make yourself familiar with that template, because whenever you ask yourself the question, why is my notified body asking me this in relation to a clinical evaluation? This is probably coming from that MDCG template, because this is some information notified body needs to assess during the review. So going into that, a little bit not directly or very related to clinical data as a clinical relation plan. It was somehow introduced through the back door, I would say, with the MEDEF 271 revision 4 that talked about scoping and planning. And now with the MDR Annex 14, we clearly have the requirement for all medical devices and this is regardless if it's a new device or a legacy device, to have a clinical evaluation plan, which should cover the whole life cycle of the device. And there are a couple of things that are highlighted here, which are also newly introduced with the MDR. It's definition of a target group. With the MDD, of course, you were required in your IFU and your labeling define indication, contraindication, but there was no real requirement of really define that target group. Let's say, how about what is pediatric population? What is, let's say, pregnant breastfeeding women? Is this a population that probably needs to be excluded? So now really the manufacturer is required to define this target population, and then of course to ensure throughout the life cycle of that device to get sufficient data for the whole target population. Another very interesting and new aspect is the clinical benefit to patients with relevant and specified clinical outcome parameters. MDR in Article 2 defines clinical benefit as like the positive effect the device is having on the patient. So it's not necessarily the intended use. Let's say if you have an intended use, being a hip prosthesis, you would probably say it's something intended use like, okay, replacing defected or arthritic hip joint. This is not necessarily the benefit for the patient. The benefit for the patient could, for example, be restoring mobility, reducing pain, regaining mobility. There's a lot of different things that needs to be considered, and the manufacturer has to define them in their clinical evaluation plan, and of course provide the specific outcome parameters like radiological scores, if it's a bony implant, or any kind of other patient scores to confirm these clinical benefits to the patient. And the last topic down on the bottom right, clinical development plan. That's something that was not around before the MDR. The MDR clearly requires the clinical development plan to be part of the clinical evaluation plan. Of course, a clinical development plan is much more relevant also for the notified body, for the review of the notified body for a new medical device. But it's also required, it's addressed it has to be addressed in the clinical evaluation plan for a legacy device. But of course, for legacy device, it probably could be a summary, let's say, of the clinical development plan. What were the steps the manufacturer took? What probably did he do in a preclinical setting before he obtained the CE mark? In general, I mean, nothing new here. For implantable and Class 3 devices, as a general rule, clinical investigation would be expected. That's roughly the same wording we had in the MDD, but of course, we all know there were a lot of different possibilities. So there were exemptions where a manufacturer could obtain CE mark without having a pre-market clinical investigation. One big factor which I think notified bodies have seen quite a lot in the past with the MDD, AIMDD, was the equivalence approach. That is still possible with the MDR, but has become much more stringent. And of course, also everything we're talking about here right now also applies to any kind of drug device combinations. So if the drug device combination was in the past relying on clinical data from the equivalent device, the same is gonna apply here as well. And I have a little bit more detail on that, on the definition and the interpretation of that more stringent equivalence demonstration. Another aspects are legacy devices. Legacy devices are any device which is already marketed under the directive, so either the MDD or the AIMDD. And then we have this Article 61.6b, a list of exempted devices which are not required to have clinical data. This is this list with, I think it's dental implants, sutures, plates, screws. It's a lot of a little store of different type of devices. If they have sufficient data, if they can be demonstrated that those type of devices have sufficient data, then of course a pre-market clinical investigation would not be required. Talking about equivalence here, as I said, the MDCG 2020-5 provides a little bit more clarification on the definition of equivalence. Those of you who are familiar with the MEDEF 271 revision 4 criteria for equivalence, still those three characteristics clinical. The wording has changed a little bit. It become a little bit more loosened up, especially in the technical characteristics. They now talk about similar instead of the same characteristics. but the principle is still the same. Those differences between your device and the proposed equivalent device can only be to such an extent that there would have no clinically significant difference. I mean, of course, what does the clinically significant difference mean? It depends on the device. Let's say, for example, in the hip prosthesis, you can implant the femoral stem of hip prosthesis, cemented and non-cemented. Those devices have different surface characteristics. They have a little bit design differences. Of course, it will never be possible to compare a cemented with a non-cemented hip prosthesis, as an example. If you have this kind of differences, of course, that has to be based on a proper scientific justification, has to be based on preclinical data. Just a descriptive demonstration of equivalence, putting basically pictures of the two devices next to each other, and maybe have some information from the IFU of the equivalent device, and just comparing the wording is not sufficient. And here's the last but most important topic: manufacturer has to demonstrate sufficient level of access to the technical documentation of the device they're claiming equivalence to. So, and this has to be done by a contract. So meaning a contract between the manufacturer A and manufacturer B, or the manufacturer of the equivalent or proposed equivalent device. In case those devices, and this contract is required for all implantable and all class 3 devices. It's coming from the same manufacturer. Well, the manufacturer should have sufficient access to his own technical documentation, so he's able to demonstrate in a detailed way. And the MDCG 2020-5 document has a nice table at the end that should be used, because it's very important that with the equivalence demonstration, manufacturers should focus on the differences. In the past, we've seen it quite often. Manufacturers were more focusing to demonstrate all the similarities, or even where it's really basically identical, the two devices, but they really should focus on explaining and substantiating those differences between the two devices. And if the manufacturer claims equivalence to one of his own device, this can be already CE mark under the MDD or AMDD. If a manufacturer is claiming equivalence to a different manufacturer, then he needs to have that contract in place that allows the manufacturer continuous access to the full technical documentation. And this equivalent or proposed equivalent device needs to be MDR certified. If you look at that, first of all, the other device already needs to be MDR certified. Right now, there's a very low number of MDR certified devices on the market. Second of all, which manufacturer is giving his competitor full access to his technical documentation? We might gonna see this. I'm not gonna say it's impossible, but I think this is gonna make the equivalence path very narrow compared to what we've seen with the MDD. If it's a non-implantable to A to B device, it's a little bit less restrictive. So no contract is required, but still the manufacturer need to demonstrate, okay, he has sufficient level of access to the technical documentation, maybe with comparative bench testing or something like that. Currently, the majority, I would say 95% of the MDR applications we are seeing at TÜV Süd, and I'm pretty sure it looks very similar at the other notified bodies, are for legacy devices. Legacy devices, every device which is already MDD or AMDD certified. And of course, some devices want to get up classified. The problem is some of those devices who probably did not come under such a high scrutiny, only to the sampling process in the past by a notified body. So manufacturer, of course, might have identified some data gaps they are having for, especially to A to B devices, which are now coming under the higher scrutiny. And of course, it is not the intention of the MDR to basically obsolete a lot of medical devices that are well approved and used widely, just because they might have some gap of clinical data. So this is why we have this MDCG 2020-6 guidance document to basically help manufacturer to keep legacy devices on the market as long as they fulfill certain requirements. So there's this definition now in this MDCG document on a well-established technology. It's either a relatively simple, common, stable design. The device group has to have well-known safety and risk benefits. There should have been no real big problems, safety issues in the past, and of course it should be a certain history on the market. So not every device, of course, which is a legacy device, automatically is a well-established technology. So on the right-hand side, you see this X-ray with two Kirschner wires. They are around since, I think, 110 years. Of Of course, the state of the art where those Kirschner wires are going to get used have changed, but this is a well-established technology. They're still in use today. On the bottom, this is a bunch of spinal disc replacements, spinal disc prosthesis. They also have a fairly long history. I think they started in the 80s of the last century, but there were a lot of problems. You see different designs. So there's not one common design that really was proved to be superior than the other designs. There were a lot of recalls. So those devices, even if they would fulfill one or two of those criteria, would not be considered a well-established technology. But for those devices which are well-established technology and for which are not sufficient data on the market, the MDCG 2020-6 basically allows for that type of devices to use clinical data on a lower evidence level. Let's say, for example, only state-of-the-art data to keep the devices on the market under the MDR. But then, of course, like with the equivalence demonstration, the manufacturer needs to close this gap with clinical data on its own in the post-market clinical follow-up. So coming, as I said, now to the, as they call it here, the unique products, is the combination products. I mean, and again, one important thing for those drug device combinations is, okay, what is the relevant part? Is it the integral part? Is the medicinal product, or is it the medical device? If you look at the bottom, you see maybe a covered stent, let's say a coronary stent that is covered with some medical medicinal product. Then, of course, it's still the main function is the stent, is the medical device to keep the coronary artery open. On the other hand, if you look at the top, there's this syringe. If it's, let's say, only a syringe that probably is used, a pre-filled syringe with a chemotherapeutic, then of course the integral part, the main part is the medicinal product and not the medical device. So at the end, of course, the manufacturer has to make a decision on its own. It's I'm not very familiar with those with the 2001/83 regulation for medicinal products, but it's much more stringent and much more complex than the medical device regulation. And of course, if you are going to apply to have it as a medicinal as a medical device with a combination product, the notified body is gonna check during the application process your classification of that device. Yeah, some things have changed. As I said, now with the MDR, all since the initial or the first application under the MDR will always be considered like a first initial application. So all devices, even the legacy devices, have to undergo a reconsultation depending on the previous consultation, a report from the competent authority. It might be only a short consultation, but this is decided by the authorities. Also with the MDD, there was this passus that certain devices would not be required a consultation procedure if the medicinal product is not reliable act upon the body. This is now removed with the MDR. So for the MDR, all medical devices which in some form incorporate the medicinal product have to undergo a consultation. So this is one of the big differences here. Again, as I said, with the clinical data, there's no real difference between a medical device that incorporates a medicinal substance or not, because the manufacturer need to have the clinical data, need to demonstrate safety and performance of the device. And when it comes to equivalence, for example, if you have, let's say, an uncoated and a coated version of your stent, it would not be possible to claim equivalence between the coated version, this is coated with, I don't know, let's just say it's something with heparin, with the uncoated version. Also, if you have different type of coatings, if you have different medicinal products, let's say an antibiotic-loaded bone cement, there are different underloaded bone cements with different antibiotic substances. It's not possible to claim an equivalence between different devices with different medicinal products incorporated. This is just quickly the number of documentation which this is required. As I said, there's the MDCG 2020-12 providing that information regarding that consultation procedure. Please be aware the consultation time for the authorities is for those drug device combinations 210 days. The notified bodies are not allowed to continue with the certification process before the consultation report and the opinion was provided by the authority. So you have to factor that in. If you have a device that contains a medicinal product as an integral part, be aware that the certification process will be much, much longer just because of this very long period of time that is reserved for that consultation process with the authority. Software as a medical device, after that, this is kind of a little bit, especially for us clinicians, a little bit of uncharted territory. We have not seen it that much often. Being an orthopedic surgeon responsible for the orthopedic team myself, I'm not going to see a lot of those softwares. I'm not going to see a lot of active devices. But there's two clear definitions we have to differentiate here. It's either as a software only be using to, let's say, drive a device, or does the software really has an intended purpose of its own. There are a couple of examples down there. Let's say the second example, a smartwatch. I'm not mentioning the company, but everyone has smartwatches those days. A lot of them now can measure blood pressure, EKGs. If this is only correcting, it's only the software would, for example, only record an EKG and would put up a nice graphic on your smartphone. No one cares. This would be considered consumer electronics, so this would be only the software which is related to the device driving that device. But like in this case, if the smartwatch then would alarm the patient, if they would detect, let's say, irregular or high heart rhythm, and probably would send an alarm to the patient or maybe even to the doctor of the patient, then of course the software would have its own intended purpose. And then of course the manufacturer would need to have clinical data, would need to consider this either in the clinical evaluation report for the smartwatch itself, or have an own clinical evaluation just for that type of software. And this is also then a difference, of course. This is from the NDCG 2020-1. Depending if it's a standalone software, if it's a software which is related, like in the second example here, to I just talked about the medical device, like in this case a smartwatch. Then of course the clinical evaluation needs to consider the software plus the device itself. It's a standalone software, like any software that probably can calculate, I don't know, therapeutic outcome for certain therapies. Then of course the manufacturer would need to have clinical data for the software alone. And in case the software is only driving or influence use of the medical device and is not having any intended purpose on its own, it's just, let's say, running, make sure that the active device is running. Then of course no clinical data or no clinical evaluation for the software itself would be required. This was a very quick run through the requirements under the MDR for clinical data. As I said, there's no real difference between those different devices. The basic requirements of the Article 61 are valid for all devices. Something that really this is very important, that the equivalence demonstration that we have seen in the past will no longer be valid for most devices. There is a way out with the legacy devices with this NDCG 2020-6. And of course, any kind of data gap that manufacturers are identifying at this point need to be addressed in the PMCF. And I think with that, this was the end, and thank you for your attention. And I'm open to any questions later on in the Q&A session.
Great, thank you. Make sure I have control now. Perfect. Okay, thank you to both Dr. Fink and Dr. Mishra for those insightful and thorough presentations. And before we move on to our Q&A panel, I would like to now move into a deeper dive into our services and then walk you through a brief collection of our case studies to see how we at Celligence have assisted our clients with their clinical evaluations under the EU MDR. So here you can see our team's expertise in many areas of RA and QA for medical devices. We have worked on both MDR and UDMED consulting projects, among others, and we can make sure your device is compliant under the MDR IVDER and FDA 510K, and as well as other global markets, including China and the ICH. We have worked with multiple clients in many therapeutic areas, as you can see here, some of which include ophthalmology, dental, and oncology. And our experience is vast and deep, with over 100 years of cumulative experience with a global pool of subject matter experts based in the US, Europe, and Asia Pacific. For a more in-depth look at our services, I encourage you to reach out to me today or explore our website for more information. We are also developing technology at Celligence to help improve our team's ability to support our customers with MDR compliance. To start, we have focused on ensuring that labor-intensive elements of writing the CER, such as literature review and adverse event data analysis, is made much more efficient by our team by utilizing our proprietary technology, with our solution aiming to achieve a 20% time reduction in the time for our medical writers. Our clients will be able to get a quick snapshot of project progress, and we can ensure to achieve our ultimate goal of improved compliance and lower costs to our customers. We would be happy to explain more about this innovative technology solution during a dedicated session with a complete demonstration of our latest product release. So now moving on to our first case study. In this case, Celligence was tasked with authoring MDR compliant CEPs and CERs for a manufacturer of dental equipment and imaging products. This was a multi-year contract that involved multiple business units, with our deliverables including new CERs and CER revisions, as well as complete literature review reports. In all, through the first 2 years of this contract, we have offered over 50 CERs, with over 50% of these being approved during the first round of reviews by the notified body. Moving on to this next case study. This summarizes the support that Celligence provided for a manufacturer of a non-invasive radiosurgical equipment. The deliverables of this project were an MDR gap analysis, remediation of their CER, and a literature review report. And in all, we reviewed over 700 documents and remediated over 280 clauses from our initial gap analysis to achieve close to 0 observations from the notified body. Additionally, we led classroom training sessions with their team regarding authoring CERs in compliance with the MDR for future projects. In this final case study we will look at today, we were contracted to support a global multinational pharmaceutical company in developing templates for their CEP, CER, and PMCF plan and report in compliance with MDR and IMDRF requirements. Their portfolio of products were in the therapeutic areas of ophthalmology, respiratory, and dermatology. This included both drug-device combination products as well as software as a medical device products. Along with our compliant templates we were able to build, we were able to develop new standard operating procedures for our clients' clinical evaluations and PMCF reports. Now, before we get into our Q&A panel from our presenters, I would like to quickly review the additional resources Celligence has to offer. On our website, celligence.com, we have additional case studies if you would like to read into more depth into some of our experiences. We also have additional information about our entire array of services and capabilities, as well as our technological solution that is available on our site for review. You can also stay up to date with industry and Celligence-related news with our consistent blog content. And additionally, we have produced 2 webinars in recent months that you can watch on demand on the Celligence YouTube channel. This includes our webcast titled How to Start Preparing Your RA/QA Team for the UTMed Database from this past September, as well as an additional webinar titled Taking Advantage of the EU MDR in Uncertain Times, which was this past July. And again, feel free to contact me with any questions or queries at the email address at the bottom of this slide. So now I would like to ask our discussion panelists to unmute themselves as we will be moving on to the first question. So this question is for Dr. Fink. Does the PSUR need to be included in the CER?
No, I mean, the PSUR, the Periodic Safety Update Report, I mean, we didn't discuss PMS requirements, but the PSUR is a separate document Of course, it incorporates maybe some data which are also coming from the CR, but it's not directly linked to the CR, because don't forget, for implantable 2V and Class 3 devices, the notified bodies will review the PSURs annually on an annual basis. And you do not need to update the CR, of course, the full CR on that. So it will be a separate document. It might be reviewed in combination with the PSUR, but it should not be included. It's not included in the CR itself.
Thank you. Now moving on to our next question, which is for Dr. John Bradshaw as well as Dr. Fink. How do we know if our clinical data will be considered sufficient?
Please go ahead, Dr. Fink.
Oh, thank you. Well, that will probably fill the entire rest of the half hour we have for this webinar. There is no easy answer what is sufficient. I mean, for legacy devices, we have the MDCG 2020-6 that might help to answer that question. Manufacturers always approach notified bodies. Okay, is there any guidance coming up? Can you tell me what is sufficient clinical data? How many patients would I need to have to? There is no easy answer. This is not a simple one-fits-all solution. It depends on the device. It depends on the risk class of the device, on the market history of your device. I mean, at the end, this is the wording from the MDR. You need to have sufficient data over the for all indications to demonstrate safety and performance over the expected lifetime. So let's say if you have an implant that ideally stays in the body for the rest of the patient's life, at some point, if you give this to a young, let's say a 30-year-old patient, you would need to have 50-year data for that. So of course, is this feasible? Now, for long-term implant, is it feasible to have a pre-market clinical study for 10 years? No, of course not. Yeah. So, but let's say if you have an absorbable implant that is resolved within 12 months in the body, yeah, of course you can have a sufficient pre-market investigation with a certain patient population that would cover the whole implant lifetime of the device. So the basic message is here, it's not that simple, it's not that easy. The state of the art for your device and for similar devices or alternative treatment options clearly help, because it gives you an indication. It also depends on the quantity of the indication. I mean, if you have an osteoarthritis of the hip, this is a very, very broad indication. You see this quite often. Hundreds of thousands of hip implants are going to get implanted for that per year. But if you have a very specialized implant, let's say for tumor surgery, and where we only might sell 40, 50 devices globally over the year because it's such a rare indication, you cannot compare this. You cannot say the same number of patients would be valid for both devices. So long story short here, it's not an easy question to answer. It really depends. Look at the device you're having, look at your indications, look at your proposed lifetime, look at the data sources you might be able to access, especially in the PMCF setting. And don't forget, PMCF is basically a lifelong requirement for a device. And of course, at some point, you probably might be able to close that gap and get close to that sufficient kind of data.
Yes, I totally agree. Just emphasizing those points, but I'd just add also the requirement from the GSPRs is for risk to be reduced as far as possible. So look closely at your risk management and your PMCF activities to determine if you've got a PMCF plan that is going to justify and detail an approach or provide a justification for why it's not necessary. It will bear a lot of influence also from your state of the art, because this is increasingly compared to that of your competitors. So you should be aware of what your competition is doing as well. In addition to those things, use your guidance documents.
Great, thank you. Now, as a follow-up to that last question, so this is for both Dr. Fink and Dr. Bradshaw again. For existing devices, how can we structure our post-market data analysis so that we do not need to generate new clinical data?
Well, if you answer the previous question, you have sufficient data for your device, you probably would not need that. I mean, the post-market surveillance is as long as the device is on the market, as long as the device is somewhere implanted, it's a requirement to follow up with the post-market surveillance and the vigilance system. As I said, there is some option here for legacy devices to go with the MDCG 2020-6 clinical data on similar devices from the state of the art. But then, of course, you need to close this data gap on your own device. I mean, to stop generate new clinical data, and clinical data is a very broad term. The MDR talks about general and specific PMCF activities. Again, it depends on the risk class of your device. Of course, if you, let's say, have a class 2A instrument that has not a direct, real big impact on the patient. Of course, at some point, you probably have sufficient data that could be considered sufficient clinical data. But for implantable devices, at this point, I think it would be nearly impossible to not have any kind of specific PMCF activity to get more data.
So post-market data should be sort of considered as well in a sort of a spectrum where, you know, cost should be considered, but there's some kind of a spectrum that goes from lower levels of commitment to higher levels of commitment that looks something like, you know, you start with literature review, move on to proactive product returns, move on to customer surveys, could consider consumer focus groups. Then moving on up, you've got retrospective patient reviews, record reviews. Finally, you know, moving up, you would go on to registry studies, and then finally, clinical investigations that may be randomized. So, you know, you've got a broad variety of different modalities to use. A legal manufacturer needs to determine how comfortable they are with their indications and claims, and with the cost aspects, and determine how far in that spectrum they're ready to wade and bear the risk for what they haven't committed to. So, you know, you need to find a comfortable place in that spectrum where you're ready to go to an audit when it comes to an MDR audit.
Great. Thank you to both of you. Now, Dr. Fink, I have one more question for you. What are the specific requirements for clinical investigations being conducted outside of the EU?
I mean, depends. I mean, you have to differentiate a little bit here between pre-market and post-market investigations. So, of course, you can always use, if you conducted or you have a device already marketed outside of the European Union and you conduct a post-market study there, you of course might be able to use this for the initial CE mark in Europe. Then, of course, if you're planning to do a new study, always take into considerations the requirements of Annex 15 of the MDR. And of course, I mean but this goes without any saying. I mean, every clinical study, regardless in what part of the world it's conducted, should follow the ethical and scientific standards. So, of course, GCP or ISO 14155 should always be considered. And one thing, of course, when it comes to the transferability of the data, the MEDEF 271 revision 4 talked about transferability of clinical data outside the European Union to the European population. The MDR doesn't really require that, but of course, the notified body might challenge you on that. If you have the same device that probably might get used for a completely different patient population, maybe even a much younger patient population in, let's say, a second world country, when you conduct a study there, and then you're trying to transfer this kind of data into the European Union for probably a completely different patient population. The notified body is going to challenge you and say, okay, but now you have a lot of data on a patient population with an average age of 40 years old, and now you're applying for the same, for a different indication for the European Union. Yes, it's the same device, but now you have a patient population with an average age of 65 to 70. So there clearly are some limitations. In general, if the data is transferable, it is no problem to use this outside of the European Union data. But as I said, talk to your study investigators, talk to your clinicians, your clinical experts, if this really is the case, if this data really can be transferred from a clinical perspective.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Fink. Now I have a couple questions for Sharma. So the first one here is, should Vigilance administered by the EMA be one of the databases to consider for clinical evaluations of DDCs?
The straight answer is no, because Vigilance is talking about the drug entity or the medicinal product. So technically, from a device point of view, considering the risks which have been arising from medicinal product can be considered as a part of the clinical evaluation, but considering vigilance is not a source, because notified body opinion reports are completely based on devices and the device interactions with the medicinal product. You are supposed to be taking account of the device and its interactions in the drug device combinations. So the straight answer is, please do not take any of the information from vigilance.
Great, thank you. And I have another question for you here, Sharma. Does PSUR in this context mean pharmacovigilance of the combination products submitted to the EMA?
No, it's a very tricky question and a very good point to raise. Periodic safety update reports are completely based on the risk classification. Class 3 devices, implants requiring annual submission of the PSUR reports, and 2B, going across with 2B as well requiring annual submissions, 2A requiring like once every 2 years. These are summary information which you are drawing from risk management, clinical evaluation, and post-market surveillance. But if it is in case you're trying to work out with the risk classification, put it this way, implants will have a direct implication from PSUR to the Article 18 with the implant card and Article 32 with the SSCP, Summary Safety Clinical Performance. So technically, PSUR is skimming off the summary executive information from clinical evaluation, from post-market surveillance, or any of the other product performance studies. So this should not be including the pharmacovigilance or any of the medicinal products. But point to be taken, any of the intricate risks which are associated with the device drug interactions should be proactively considered.
Great, thank you, Sharma. This next question I have is for you, John. For DDCs using platform technologies, there could be a large volume of clinical trial data. How do we decide which trials to include in the CER?
So kind of echoing what we've heard in presentations today, I would suggest that the clinical investigation section of the CER be organized by clinical indication and the evidence supporting a clinical indication presented together. So in addition, some clinical indications do not support a specific indicated use. If that's a particular instance you're worried about, there are two ways that you can think about that. In the event that you have strong evidence from the remaining clinical investigations, you may just decide that you can drop the study and only list the pivotal studies, for instance. That's an approach that we've seen previously. On the other hand, if you have a limited number of studies and you need the evidence to show support for overall clinical safety and efficacy, put it in a general section, which may precede your specific indications, and whether that is an approach that your notified body approves remains to be seen. That will depend entirely upon your notified body and your relationship with them. But I would seek, the guidance from the notified body if you have concerns about it.
Great, thank you, John. So this next question is for Sharma, and if John wants to chime in as well. So if you have conducted several clinical investigations for an integral device, does it still require a PMCF study?
PMCF is a scale down of a clinical investigation. Clinical investigation, otherwise called as clinical trial, is a segment within the clinical evaluation part. So technically, if we have some of the problems which could not be answered in a holistic approach in a clinical investigation, have to be addressed in a singled PMCF study. This is particularly in terms of high-risk products. It is not possible to bring or answer all of the questions which are related to the biocompatibility, shelf life, talking about the performance, talking about efficacy. And in those areas, if there is a question or turning up some of the trends raised from the customer complaints or CAPAs, it is always advisable that the notified body will be trying to look for objective evidence. What is the proactive approach of the manufacturer, identifying such CAPA investigations and singling out a PMCF study. So it's not possible to conclude if one study is enough or a bunch of 10 studies are required. So if we come across like there is a substantial number of clinical investigations conducted on a product, we still will be forgetting or have oversight of some of the other corners. So when the product is performing in the market, you will come across time to time some of the live information or issues with the device failure or device incompatibility, side effects, or any other areas which have to be considered as a single study, which is the particular scope for the post-market clinical follow-up. So that is supposed to be a tradition, has to be conducted at a regular intervals. MDR doesn't say PMCF has to be conducted once every 5 years or once every 10 years, but it should be a proactive approach of the manufacturer to conduct. But otherwise, PMCF sources the information for clinical evaluation, post-market surveillance, and those are taken once again into PSUR and SSCP segments. So please make sure PMCF is a tradition of your product trend analysis.
Great.
Yes,
Thank you for that.
I totally agree and emphasize exactly what Sharma just mentioned. The requirement of your PMCF data collection is to be proactive. So if you look retrospectively at your data and your clinical investigations, which are large, you may be able to satisfy your PMCF requirement with something simple like a literature review. This is something that if you have concerns about, discuss it with your notified body. So there are instances where you might be able to get away with not doing a PMCF plan, maybe justifying it, and I would mention that those would be things that, for instance, you're obsoleting or that you're keeping in the field only as capital equipment, and you're not introducing new versions of the software or of the device. In those instances, you may be able to effectively use a justification approach to address your PMCF requirements, but I would still have a PMCF justification document in your QMS in order to go into an audit.
That's right.
Great. Thank you to both John and Sharma. I have one more question for the both of you. Which GSPRs are relevant to include in the clinical evaluation for a DDC?
In a direct sense, if you can segregate or categorize the entire general safety performance requirements, you have 3 essential chapters. One of the is the chapter 1, which is the general requirements, which is GSPR going from 1 all the way to 9. They are mandatory. Any of the manufacturers have to comply. So if you go to the chapter 2, which is talking about the design and manufacture, and the chapter 3, which is information and information and other kind of information which has been provided with along with the device, we need to categorically understand that from 1 all the way to 9, in most of the situations, it talk about a risk-benefit analysis. So for a drug-device combination, we need to essentially understand which of those segments can be demonstrated from the risk management point of view. straight to the point, GSPR 12.1, 12.2 focus at medicinal product directives 2001/83 EC. If you see any of those medicinal products and the device, how the way they are integrated, the DDCs are integral DDCs or a non-integral DDCs, you need to take a decision about how the way the drug is interacting with the device. So the interaction of the device with any of the other components of the device, which may be medicinal products or other, you need to define it in the terms of risk management. So please focus at GSPR 12.1, 12.2 towards labeling 10.4.5. One of these significant point which I would reiterate from Dr. Pratibha's presentation earlier, saying that the labeling of the device component will be overruled by the medicinal product regulations. So technically, even if you are going to mention single use or do not re-sterilize or any other kind of a labeling, they are only pertaining to the device part. So you need to be cautious about assessing the risk. So please do take proactive approach towards labeling on as per 10.4.5. And going across the mandatory information which you're providing in your IFU from GSPR 23 these are the essential bits. So please focus at GSPR 1 to 9, 12.1, 12.2, 10.4.5, and towards 23.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I totally echo Sharma's points there. Just consider all of the mentions of risk and then the benefit risk ratio when you're answering that question. And, anytime that a risk is revealed, you should mention that in your clinical evaluation.
Thank you both. We have time for a handful more questions. So this next question is for you, Dr. Fink. For software that is an accessory to a medical device, what kind of clinical evidence is required?
I mean, if you can recap the last two slides I had on the software, I mean, as I said, it depends what the software is doing. If the software is just there to drive the device, so just saying, okay, go back to the example I had with the smartwatch. If the smartwatch is maybe only showing your EKG on the display, but there's no function of its own. It's not going to alert you if it's too high. It's not going to analyze it. Only showing, oh, it's recording an EKG, and you can see the EKG on your display. Then of course the software has no function. I mean, of course it has to be then reviewed and in combination with the device itself. So of course you need to have clinical data for the device itself, but you do not need to address it separately for that software. But if the software has its own intended purpose, or if the software is playing a relevant part, as I said, if the software basically is making a decision, okay, I have to alarm the doctor because the heart rate is going to go too high, then of course you need to have that clinical data specifically for that intended use of the software as well. And then it depends, again, as I said, there's this MDG 2019, I forgot the number, on the classification of the software. So what type of risk class the software should be considered. And depending on that risk class of the software, of course, that is the, let's say, the amount and quality of clinical data you would need. But again, it really depends on what is the manufacturer's definition, what the software really is doing.
Great, thank you for that. Now this next question is for John as well as Dr. Fink, if you have any thoughts. How do we know what type of PMCF we need to conduct?
So I would go back to, as I discussed a moment ago, the spectrum of activities that can be considered in post-market clinical follow-up. So for those of you that didn't hear it previously, from the end of the spectrum that is the least commitment to the greatest, it goes something like literature review, proactive product returns, surveys, consumer focus groups, retrospective patient record reviews, registry studies, and finally, full-bore clinical trial, perhaps randomized. So in order to really address the question, you have to get a gut feeling for the amount of risk that the legal manufacturer is willing to carry into the future, and then balance that with the costs in terms of time and money to collect each type of investigative data. Some manufacturers will have deep pockets, and they will be able to proceed further into the spectrum, where others will understand that they have relatively little resource, high costs, and relatively little time before their relevant certs expire. So they may have to even delay their MDR audits until they are able to complete one or more of the investigations listed. But I would, you know, just you have to kind of just develop a gut feeling for your resources and the levels of risk that you deal with and the clinical indications that you're addressing.
Yeah, and also coming a little bit more now is that the clinician really talking in me, really coming from that perspective. Of course, what the PMCF should do, we should get this type of, as always said, the real world data. Because quite often, let's have an example, you do one pre-market investigation, that is usually a single center investigation. It's done at a highly specialized center, probably even with one of the inventors of the device, who is usually highly experienced in a specific field. So you get a very good, hopefully for the company and for the patient, you get very good results. But then the question, of course, what's happening if now I take this device, as I said, it could be, let's say, a joint implant, could be a heart valve, which might be a little bit more complex, and you need some kind of experience with that device, and then take it into, let's say, the real world out there. Do I get the same results if I go, let's say, from a high volume center with 500 procedures per year to a community-based hospital with, say, 50, 60 procedures per year? Yes, for certain devices which are very simple in the design and have a very simple surgical technique, that might work. But for very complex devices, let's say revision, hip, knee, shoulder prosthesis, there is a certain, quite a learning curve, and there is you need some experience for that. And this the same, of course, is valid for the PMCF. We do not want to see PMCF studies that basically has one page of exclusion criteria, basically exclude half the patients which are indicated for that device, just because the manufacturer is trying to get the best results. It's not the goal of the results to demonstrating a device is functioning. That should be done in a pre-market setting, in a pre-market investigation. The post-market setting is really meant for, okay, we have to demonstrate or we have to confirm that device is really working in all the patient populations we are having. So that's why talking about this type of real-world data, there are a couple of registries out there, and if you look at registries which are basically some form of data collection without any specific endpoints. In the orthopedic field, there are a lot of national joint registries in different European countries. Some of them go back 40 years with clinical data over 40 years. That, of course, has a much higher validity. If you get, let's say, 5,000 patients covered in a registry over 20 years for your device, that, of course, outweighs all type of PMCF study design, even if it's a control study with, say, 50, 100, 200 patients. So really the emphasis always is, okay, how do we get this type of real world data in there? How can we ensure we cover all possible patient populations in our PMCF setting?
Great, thank you for that. So for this next question, I would like Dr. John Bradsher to elaborate on how to deal with legacy devices with a lack of clinical data.
Okay, well, once again, you know, you need to consider, as a legal manufacturer, you need to consider, you know, the list, which goes from literature to review to clinical investigation. You need to take into consideration the risk level of the device and then develop a sense for the cost in terms of time and expense and balance that with the available resources for the manufacturer. And then, you know, of course, you want to address the clinical gaps that exist. We should bear in mind, as Dr. Fink mentioned earlier, there's an MDCG guidance on this. The 2020.6, I believe, is the designation for that one. Be sure to use that guidance as well. It is not unreasonable to suggest to your notified body that an investigation may be at considerable expense, and it would require the legal manufacturer to complete it over several years or calendar quarters. But I believe the most important thing the notified body wants to see is that you have a plan to address the gaps in your approach, and you need to proceed with the negotiation with them.
Great, thank you, John. I believe we might have time for one or two more questions. This next question is again for you, John. In many instances, indications for use remain silent on patient groups that are regarded as sensitive populations by MedDev 2.12/2. Will these practices be allowed after the date of effectivity for the MDR?
Well, this is an area that I think it kind of falls into an area of best practice. I can't really say what regulation will be enforced in what way, but my sense is that this is an area of long ignored regulatory obligation. There are two relevant risk trajectories to be considered. In the first, the legal manufacturers remain silent on use in pediatric and elderly patients, and they decline to prepare themselves accordingly. In such cases, it would be, difficult for the personnel in the audit to bear the risk to be asked for this at any time. If it doesn't occur during the first audit, this could occur during subsequent audits. So this is not really a safe trajectory. The alternative is for a manufacturer that remains silent on indications in sensitive populations to prepare a post-market clinical follow-up plan and otherwise document investigations that would have been done in pediatric and elderly populations. Such documents would provide the basis for claiming that the legal manufacturer is addressing what has been this area of regulatory obligation.
Yeah, maybe a quick comment from my side. I fully agree what John just said here. Yeah? I mean, pediatric patient population, it really depends. Of course, what is the device doing? What is the type of the device? I mean, as we all know, children are no small adults. Yeah, there are differences. Yeah. So it depends. There probably might be a different state of the art how to treat a pediatric population with the same indication. Yeah. In the orthopedic, we see a lot of devices which are intended for adult patients, but would be not state of the art to use them for a pediatric patient population. Yeah. Same as with the elderly. I mean, there are certain differences. Let's say 80 years and older. Yeah, that needs to be considered. For medicinal products and for medical devices. So at some point, of course, the manufacturer needs to address this in his PMCF setting, as John just said. And don't forget, with the MDR, manufacturers now clearly need to define the target population. And if the manufacturer defines a target population with no age limitations, the notified bodies is going to challenge manufacturers. Okay, are you able to provide? Are you able to confirm safety and performance for all the different age populations you're claiming on your labeling?
Great, thank you both. I believe we are just about out of time, and that brings us to the end of our Q&A session. I would like to thank our two presenters, both Dr. Matthias Fink and Dr. Pratibha Mishra, for those wonderful presentations today. And also, as well, thank you to John and Sharma for being part of our discussion panel and Q&A. Very, very insightful and helpful. And thank you to everyone else who joined, and thank you to RAPS for putting on this presentation. I wish everyone a wonderful rest of your day or evening or morning, depending on where you might be. But thank you for joining.